Hello, I'm Dr. John Morris of the Institute for Creation Research and Professor of Geology in the Graduate School here at ICR. The decade of the 1990s promises to be a most intriguing and enlightening one as we attempt to research and answer this question of origins. Did we get here by evolution, the products of random processes like mutation and natural selection, or were we created by design, by an intelligent designer? Mr. Roger Oakland, lecturer and author and former university biology teacher, frequently lectures on this subject to both technical and lay audiences. I encourage you to watch this video to follow with an open mind and allow your own thinking to be challenged and enlightened by this intriguing evidence.
The subject of origins. Indeed, it is a controversial issue because there was no one there in the beginning to make observations of what took place. There are basically two views. Evolution is man's speculation on this subject of what took place in the beginning and what happened. And the creation worldview, based on a biblical creationist position, accepts that in the beginning a creator God, all-powerful creator designer, brought things into existence. Now in this presentation we are going to look at and examine the foundational principles of evolution. And if evolution is true, if it can be backed up and supported by the observable evidence, then we can claim that it was a scientific model. But if it cannot be backed up and supported by the evidence, then as a scientist making observations, we should look at ways of changing our theories or ideas or our hypotheses. So let's begin to examine some of these concepts of evolution. First of all, we can ask, where did the idea begin? Who originated the evolutionary idea? Well, as I look back through the various history accounts of the idea of evolution, it can be traced to actually a metaphysical belief which begins from the Hindu belief that over long periods of time there is a progression or a development that occurs from lower levels of consciousness to higher levels of consciousness. So the idea actually goes back to an ancient Eastern religious worldview. And it's interesting that one of the first founding fathers of evolution also based his ideas on a metaphysical worldview. I refer to Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather. You see, in the 1700s, there were a group of individuals in Britain who were looking for a way to explain away God the Creator. It was shortly after the revolution that took place in France, where the church was ridiculed, and literally the Bible was burned, and man was placed in elevation, and God was tossed off the scene. But in Britain there was a reverence for the Bible, for biblical revelation. And a group of individuals gathered together once a month to have meetings. They called themselves the Lunar Society. And the head of the Lunar Society was an individual by the name of Erasmus Darwin. And so he came up with a view on the origin and the development of life based on a mystical Eastern philosophy that life could progress and develop from lower levels of consciousness to higher levels of consciousness over time. And as I mentioned, they met once a month on the full moon, which may give you some further insights into their spiritual sensitivity. Another very significant individual in the evolutionary worldview, one of the founding fathers, was this gentleman here by the name of Charles Lyell, known as the father of uniformitarianism. His view was that the layers of the earth could be explained by a gradual process that had taken place over very long periods of time. And his motive was to explain away the layers or the stratas which at that time people believed had been laid down by a global catastrophic flood which agreed with the biblical account. And Lyell, being an amateur geologist and a politician, was another one of these individuals, we could call them humanists, who wanted to replace a belief in God with a belief in man. And then, of course, the most famous of the founding fathers, Charles Darwin himself, the grandson of Erasmus Darwin. You see, Charles Darwin was not overwhelmed with facts which caused him to believe in evolution. there came a point in his life where he became disgruntled with biblical Christianity, gave up on believing in God because he had many questions and doubts that were coming to him, and so changed his worldviews and really rewrote what his grandfather had already originated in the books that he had written called the Zoonomia, and came forth with his volume called The Origin of Species. And the idea of evolution, Darwinian evolution, literally has reshaped the thinking of minds around the world. And if there is one thing that's caused people to question the reality of God, the Creator, more than anything else, it is the teaching of evolution. For example, this gentleman took the teachings of Charles Darwin to the extreme. Karl Marx. He was actually associated with Charles Darwin. They lived together contemporaneously in London. And when Charles Darwin came up with his theory of the origin and history of life, Marx was so interested, so excited, that he attempted to dedicate one of his works to Charles Darwin. Marx, as we all know, has become the founding father of communism. And evolution was the basis or a pillar of communism and advanced throughout the former communist world through the indoctrination of scientific atheism. So evolution has had a major impact on the thinking of people around the world. Now today, many universities, colleges, high schools, secular schools are advancing the teaching of evolution as the only credible worldview on the subject of origins. And as I mentioned to you, at one time in my life, I taught from an evolutionary perspective because I believed that what I was taught must be true. Scientists who had studied all their lives on this subject of origins certainly must have assembled the facts, and so I listened to them. And I became part of their thinking. And I advanced that thinking until some changes occurred in my life, and I became a creationist, and then later a Christian. Today, if those people that are in education attempt to resist the teaching of evolution, they're labeled as religious fanatics and attempting to push science back into the Dark Ages. Because the general idea is that evolution has been proven. There is no question whatsoever, they say, that it has happened. This particular publication, called Science and Creationism, A View from the National Academy of Sciences, is a statement by the National Academy of Sciences on their position regarding creationism. They state this: the hypothesis of special creation has over nearly 2 centuries been repeatedly and sympathetically considered and rejected on evidential grounds by qualified observers and experimentalists. And then they go on to say, as a historic representative of the scientific profession and designated advisor to the federal government in matters of science, the Academy states unequivocally that the tenets of creation science are not supported by scientific evidence, and that creationism has no place in a science curriculum at any level, and that its proposed teaching would be impossible. Now that might help you to understand, especially here in the state of California, why there is a movement to advance evolution in the science classrooms without any opposition. And I refer to the science framework for California public schools from kindergarten through grade 12. And in this particular outline or guidelines for curriculum, this statement is made. In order to teach life science, earth science, or astronomy, evolution should be a fundamental central concept of the curriculum. Evolution, which Darwin described as descent with modification, is the central organizing principle in life science. And so tonight, I want to look at the foundational principles of evolution, Darwinian evolution. And we're going to examine these principles and we're going to test them against the evidence to see whether this statement that the California State Board of Education has made is true. So let's begin. The first principle of evolution. According to the evolutionary idea, in the beginning of time, there was an explosion that took place somewhere in the universe.
Hello, I'm Dr. John Morris of the Institute for Creation Research and Professor of Geology in the Graduate School here at ICR. The decade of the 1990s promises to be a most intriguing and enlightening one as we attempt to research and answer this question of origins. Did we get here by evolution, the products of random processes like mutation and natural selection, or were we created by design, by an intelligent designer? Mr. Roger Oakland, lecturer and author and former university biology teacher, frequently lectures on this subject to both
creator-designer brought things into existence. Now, in this presentation, we are going to look at and examine the foundational principles of evolution. And if evolution is true, if it can be backed up and supported by the observable evidence, then we can what took place. There are basically two views. Evolution is man's speculation on this subject of what took place in the beginning and what happened. And the creation worldview, based on a biblical creationist position, accepts that in the beginning a creator God, all-powerful,
technical and lay audiences. I encourage you to watch this video to follow with an open mind and allow your own thinking to be challenged and enlightened by this intriguing evidence.
The subject of origins. Indeed, it is a controversial issue because there was no one there in the beginning to make observations of